Hi, I'm Zoe Hartwell. 3 years ago, my father stood in front of 50 of Austin's most influential business leaders and called my company a complete failure that would bankrupt our family name. He laughed when I pitched my idea, rolled his eyes when I quit my corporate job, and publicly humiliated me when I asked for his support. But last month, when my Forbes interview aired about DataPulse Analytics' $8 million acquisition, his silence was deafening. Tonight, I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to tell you what happens when you bet on yourself, even when the people who should believe in you don't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Austin summer heat was already pressing against the windows of my downtown loft when I received the invitation that would change everything. I was 28. Running on 3 hours of sleep and my fourth cup of coffee hunched over my laptop debugging code that seemed determined to mock my every effort. The envelope slid under my door with a soft whisper, cream-colored and heavy, bearing the embossed logo of the Austin Business Excellence Awards. Richard Hartwell cordially invites you to the annual Hartwell Industries Leadership Gala. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father, the oil and manufacturing magnate who had built his empire on handshake deals and good old boy networks, was hosting an event celebrating innovation and entrepreneurship. The same innovation he'd dismissed as millennial nonsense when I'd tried to explain my business model to him 6 months earlier. I set the invitation down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Lady Bird Lake. The water stretched like molten silver under the afternoon sun, and I could see kayakers cutting lazy paths through the current. It reminded me of simpler times, when my grandfather Bill would take me fishing on weekends, telling me stories about building something meaningful with your own 2 hands. He died when I was 25, leaving behind a small workshop filled with hand-carved furniture and a legacy of quiet craftsmanship that my father had never understood. DataPulse Analytics existed because of those weekend conversations with Grandpa Bill, though he'd never lived to see it. The idea had crystallized during my last year at UT Austin, when I was studying computer science and watching small businesses struggle to understand their customer data. They had spreadsheets full of numbers but no way to translate those numbers into actionable insight. I saw an opportunity to build software that could democratize data analytics, making it accessible to companies that couldn't afford enterprise solutions. My father saw it differently. Richard Hartwell had built Hartwell Industries through shrewd investments in oil refineries and manufacturing plants, tangible assets that produced measurable results. Software was invisible to him, ethereal, untrustworthy. When I'd graduated summa cum laude and turned down a 6-figure offer from ExxonMobil to start my own company, he'd called it the most expensive mistake of your life. The confrontation had happened at Patricia's birthday dinner, my mother's 55th celebration at the Driscoll Hotel. The entire family was there, along with my father's business associates and their perfectly polished children who had all followed acceptable career paths. Marcus, my older brother, was already climbing the ranks at a prestigious law firm downtown. Cousin Jennifer had just been promoted to VP at a major bank. And there I was, the black sheep, trying to explain why I'd maxed out my credit cards to fund a startup. Zoe thinks she's going to revolutionize business with her little computer program, my father had announced to the table, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension he reserved for ideas he deemed foolish. Meanwhile, real companies are built on real assets, real products, real value. The words had stung, but it was the laughter that followed that cut deepest. Not malicious laughter, but the kind of polite chuckling that people do when they think someone has told a mildly amusing joke. Patricia had reached across the table and patted my hand with the same gesture she might use to comfort a child who'd scraped their knee. Honey, maybe it's time to consider something more stable. Your father could make some calls. I'd excused myself before dessert was served, walking out into the humid Austin night with my cheeks burning and my pride in tatters. That was the last family dinner I'd attended, the last time I'd asked for their support or validation. I'd driven home to my cramped apartment near campus and made a promise to myself that I'd prove them wrong, not through words but through results. The months that followed were brutal. I worked 16-hour days, splitting my time between coding and trying to convince potential customers that a 28-year-old woman with no business experience could solve their data problem. I lived on ramen noodles and determination, watching my savings account dwindle while my credit card debt climbed. There were nights when I'd lie awake wondering if my father had been right, if I was delusional to think I could build something meaningful from nothing. Leah Rodriguez became my lifeline during those dark months. We'd met in a graduate algorithms class and she'd believed in DataPulse from the beginning, even when I could barely articulate what I was trying to build. She'd quit her job at Google to join me as co-founder, bringing a level of technical expertise that transformed my rough concepts into elegant code. While I focused on sales and business development, Leah architected the platform that would eventually catch the attention of Fortune 500. Our first real breakthrough came through David Kim, a serial entrepreneur who'd sold 2 companies and was mentoring startups through the Austin Technology Incubator. David saw something in our pitch that others had missed: the potential to scale beyond small businesses into mid-market companies hungry for sophisticated analytics. He introduced us to our first enterprise client, a regional retail chain that was struggling to understand customer behavior across their 47 locations. The project was make or break for us. We had 6 weeks to deliver a proof of concept that would either validate our entire approach or confirm my father's prediction that I was destined for failure. Leah and I worked around the clock, surviving on energy drinks and sheer stubbornness, building custom dashboards that transformed incomprehensible data into clear, actionable insight. When we presented the results to the client's executive team, showing them how to optimize inventory, improve customer retention, and identify new revenue opportunities, the silence in the conference room was electric. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," the CEO had said, and I'd felt something shift inside me, a quiet confidence that had been missing since that humiliating dinner at the Driscoll. "How quickly can you implement this across all our locations?" The retail chain became our flagship customer, and their success story opened doors we'd never imagined possible. Word spread through Austin's tight-knit business community, and suddenly we were fielding calls from companies across Texas and beyond. We hired our first employees, moved into a proper office space in East Austin's emerging tech corridor, and started building the platform that would eventually catch the attention of acquisition-hungry tech giants. But success brought its own challenge. The bigger we grew, the more visible we became, and with visibility came scrutiny from my father's circle of influence. I'd hear whispers at industry events, comments about Richard Hartwell's daughter playing with computers, or speculation about how long it would take for me to come to her senses and join the family business. The criticism reached a crescendo at the Austin Business Excellence Awards ceremony, the same event my father hosted annually to celebrate what he considered real business achievement. I hadn't planned to attend, but David Kim had convinced me that DataPulse deserved recognition alongside Austin's established companies. We'd been nominated in the emerging technology category, and despite my reservations about facing my father's crowd, I'd agreed to present our story. Walking into the Austin Country Club that evening felt like entering enemy territory. The venue was filled with Austin's business elite, men and women who'd built their fortunes through traditional industries and viewed technology startups with skeptical amusement. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a simple black dress that projected confidence without appearing threatening, paired with the small silver compass pendant my grandfather had given me on my 18th birthday. My father was holding court near the bar, surrounded by the usual collection of oil executives and manufacturing magnates who formed the backbone of his social circle. He spotted me almost immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching annoyance. Patricia appeared at his elbow, her smile tight with the kind of forced enthusiasm she reserved for uncomfortable social situations. "Zoe, darling, what a surprise," she said, air-kissing my cheek with practiced efficiency. "Your father mentioned you might be here tonight." Richard Hartwell extended his hand with the formal courtesy he might show a business acquaintance rather than his daughter. "Zoe, I understand you're presenting tonight. Something about your computer company." The dismissive tone was subtle but unmistakable, and I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Before I could respond, Trevor Walsh materialized beside us, my father's longtime business rival and frequent golf partner. Trevor had built his own fortune in commercial real estate, and he'd never missed an opportunity to needle my father about his unconventional daughter. "Richard, you must be so proud," Trevor said with a grin that didn't reach his eye. "Not every parent gets to see their child chase their dreams so publicly. Though I have to wonder, when does optimism become delusion?" The comment hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my father's reaction carefully. This was his moment to defend me, to show some pride in what I'd accomplished, to demonstrate that family loyalty meant more than social standing. Instead, he chuckled and took a sip of his whiskey. "Well, Trevor, we all have to learn from our mistakes," he said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "Sometimes the best education comes from falling flat on your face." The conversation continued around me, but I'd stopped listening. I excused myself and found refuge in the ladies' room, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror and fighting back the tears that threatened to betray my composure. The compass pendant felt heavy against my chest and I touched it gently, remembering my grandfather's words about true north and staying the course even when the winds try to blow you off track. When they called my name to present DataPulse's story, I walked to the podium with steady steps and a clear voice. I talked about the small businesses we'd helped optimize their operations, the jobs we'd created in Austin's tech sector, and the recognition we'd received from industry analysts who called our platform innovative and scalable. I didn't mention my father or his lack of support. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. The applause was polite but lukewarm, and I could see skepticism in many faces as I returned to my table. These were people who understood oil wells and factory floors, not algorithms and cloud computing. They were waiting for me to fail, expecting confirmation that Richard Hartwell's daughter was indeed chasing an expensive fantasy. I left the ceremony early, driving home through Austin's empty streets with my grandfather's compass catching the glow of passing streetlights. The next morning, I threw myself back into work with renewed determination. If my father's world wouldn't accept what I was building, then I'd build something so undeniable that acceptance would become irrelevant. The invitation to the Hartwell Industries Leadership Gala arrived 3 months later, just as DataPulse was entering final negotiations with a major tech conglomerate interested in acquiring our platform. The timing felt deliberate, as if my father somehow knew that I was on the verge of something significant. Patricia's handwritten note was tucked inside the formal invitation, a brief message asking me to consider attending for the sake of family unity. I set the invitation aside and returned to my laptop, but the weight of decision pressed against my shoulders like Austin's summer humidity. Part of me wanted to ignore the invitation entirely, to continue building my success without seeking validation from people who'd never believed in me. But another part, the part that still remembered fishing trips with Grandpa Bill and birthday dinners before everything went wrong, wondered if this might be an opportunity to bridge the gulf that had opened between us. The decision would define not just my relationship with my family, but my understanding of what success truly meant. As I sat in my downtown loft watching the sun set over Lady Bird Lake, I realized that some battles are worth fighting not because you need to win, but because you need to know who you really are when the stakes are high. The next morning, I called Leah and asked her to meet me for coffee at our usual spot on South Lamar. She arrived with her laptop bag and the slightly frazzled look of someone who'd been wrestling with complex code since dawn, but her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Please tell me you have good news about the acquisition," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Because if I have to explain our data architecture to one more consultant who thinks APIs are something you catch from mosquitoes, I might lose my mind." I laughed despite my mood. Leah had a gift for finding humor in the most stressful situations, a quality that had saved my sanity more times than I could count. "The acquisition is moving forward. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." Over the next hour, I laid out everything. The invitation to my father's gala, the months of silence between us, the weight of proving myself to people who'd already written me off. Leah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful as I explained the complicated dynamics of the Hartwell family and their expectations. "So let me get this straight," she said finally, stirring sugar into her third cup of coffee. "Your father publicly humiliated you, dismissed your company as a failure, and now he wants you to show up at his party like nothing happened. That's about the size of it, and you're actually considering going." I stared out the window at the morning traffic on South Lamar, watching Austin's professional class hurry toward another day of meetings and deadlines. I keep thinking about what my grandfather would have done. He never backed down from a challenge, but he also never fought battles that weren't worth winning. Leah reached across the table and touched my hand, her voice gentle but firm. "Zoe, you've already won. DataPulse is about to be acquired for $8 million. We've created something amazing, something that helps real businesses solve real problems. You don't need your father's approval to validate what we've built. She was right, of course. The acquisition offer from Technova Solutions represented everything I'd dreamed of when I'd first sketched out my business plan on napkins at this same coffee shop 3 years early. We'd built a platform that enterprise clients loved, assembled a team of brilliant engineers and data scientists, and created enough value to attract serious acquisition interest from companies that understood our potential for scale. But success, I was learning, was more complicated than revenue metrics and exit strategies. There was a part of me that still carried the sting of my father's dismissal, the weight of being written off before I'd even had a chance to prove myself. Going to his gala wouldn't be about seeking approval, it would be about demonstrating that his opinion had never been the measure of my worth. I think I'm going to go, I said finally, and Leah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Really? Because I want to look him in the eye when he realizes what I've accomplished. Not for revenge, but for closure. I need to know that I can stand in his world without needing anything from it. Leah studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, but if you're going to do this, let's do it right. The Forbes interview about our acquisition is scheduled to air next week, isn't it? I'd almost forgotten about the interview. Nicole Parker, a senior reporter for Forbes, had reached out after news of our acquisition leaked through Austin's tech community. She'd wanted to profile DataPulse as an example of successful bootstrap entrepreneurship, focusing on how we'd built enterprise-level software without taking venture capital funding. The timing of the interview's release would be perfect, landing just days before my father's gala. You're thinking what I think you're thinking, I said, and Leah grinned. I'm thinking that if Richard Hartwell wants to celebrate business excellence, he should probably know what real innovation looks like. And if he's too stubborn to recognize his daughter's success, maybe he needs to hear about it from Forbes. The next week passed in a blur of final negotiations with Technova Solutions and preparation for the Forbes interview. Nicole Parker met me at DataPulse's office in East Austin, a converted warehouse space that buzzed with the energy of 20-something engineers and data scientists, building the future one line of code at a time. She was impressed by the culture we'd created, the diversity of our team, and the innovative approaches we'd developed to solve complex analytics problems. What drives you? She asked during our interview, her recorder capturing every word as we sat in the conference room overlooking Austin's skyline. What made you believe you could succeed in such a competitive space? I thought about my grandfather's workshop, about the patient way he'd taught me to measure twice and cut once, about the importance of building something that would last. I think real innovation comes from understanding problems that others overlook. We didn't set out to compete with established analytics companies. We set out to serve customers who'd been ignored by those companies, to democratize tools that had been reserved for enterprises with massive budgets. The interview would be published online the day before my father's gala, with the print edition following a week later. As Nicole packed up her equipment, she mentioned that the story would likely be picked up by other publications, possibly even making it into the business news cycle. The thought should have excited me, but instead I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. That evening I stood in my closet trying to decide what to wear to the gala. The event called for cocktail attire, which in Austin's business circles meant understated elegance with just enough sophistication to signal serious intent. I settled on a navy blue dress that projected confidence without ostentation, paired with my grandfather's compass pendant and a pair of earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. The Austin Country Club looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood, all limestone and live oaks with manicured grounds that spoke of old money and established power. Valets in crisp white shirts directed luxury cars toward parking areas, while guests in designer evening wear made their way toward the main ballroom. I recognized many faces from the city's business community, people whose companies had been featured in the Austin Business Journal and whose opinions carried weight in boardrooms across Texas. My father was greeting guests near the entrance, resplendent in his custom-tailored tuxedo and radiating the easy confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. Patricia stood beside him in an elegant black gown, her smile warm and practiced as she air-kissed cheeks and remembered names with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. They made a striking couple, the embodiment of Austin's business aristocracy. Richard spotted me before I could slip into the crowd, his expression shifting through several emotions in quick succession. Surprise, certainly, and something that might have been pride if I'd been feeling generous. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But there was also wariness there, the look of a man who'd learned not to underestimate opponents. "Zoe," he said, extending his hand with formal courtesy. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," I replied, accepting his handshake with equal formality. "But I thought it was time." Patricia swept me into an embrace that smelled of expensive perfume and nervous energy. "Darling, you look wonderful. How is your little company doing?" "Still keeping busy?" The casual dismissal in her tone was probably unconscious, but it reminded me why I'd stayed away from family gatherings for so long. "We're doing well, thank you. Actually, there's some exciting news that I think will interest you." Before I could elaborate, Trevor Walsh appeared at my father's elbow, his face flushed with bourbon and self-importance. Well, well, if it isn't the tech entrepreneur herself. "How's the computer business, Zoe? Still saving the world one spreadsheet at a time?" His laughter was harsh and braying, and I saw several other guests turn toward us with expressions of polite interest. This was exactly the kind of moment I'd dreaded, being reduced to a curiosity for the entertainment of my father's friend. But instead of the familiar knot of anxiety, I felt something else entirely. Calm. Certainty. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. "Actually, Trevor, we're being acquired," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Technova Solutions is purchasing DataPulse Analytics for $8 million. The deal closes next month." The silence that followed was electric. I watched Trevor's expression shift from smug amusement to something approaching shock, while my father's face went through a series of micro-expressions that revealed far more than he probably intended. Pride, surprise, calculation, and something that might have been regret flickered across his features in rapid succession. "8 million? Patricia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Zoe, that's wonderful, darling." But it was my father's reaction that interested me most. Richard Hartwell had built his fortune by recognizing opportunities others missed, by understanding value in all its forms. He was looking at me now with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd underestimated a competitor, and I could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about my prospect. "Congratulations," he said finally, and for the first time in years his voice carried something approaching respect. "That's quite an achievement." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other guests, and I excused myself to find a quiet corner where I could process what had just happened. The easy dismissal I'd expected hadn't materialized. Instead, I'd seen something I'd never witnessed before, my father being forced to confront the gap between his assumptions and reality. The evening progressed with a surreal quality, as if I were watching myself navigate conversations with people who'd written me off years earlier. News of the acquisition had spread through the crowd with the speed of high-quality gossip, and suddenly I found myself fielding questions about DataPulse's technology, our team, and our plans for the future. Some of the interest felt genuine, while other conversations carried the unmistakable scent of opportunism from people who'd ignored me for years, but now saw potential value in knowing me. It was during the dinner program that everything changed completely. David Kim, who'd been instrumental in connecting us with our first enterprise clients, approached my table with his phone in hand and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Zoe, have you seen this?" he asked, showing me the screen. The Forbes article just went live. I stared at the headline, "From Bootstrap to 8 Figures, How Austin Entrepreneur Zoe Hartwell Built a Data Analytics Powerhouse." Below it was a professional photo of me in our office, surrounded by the whiteboards covered in algorithms and flowcharts that represented 3 years of relentless innovation. The article was everything Nicole Parker had promised and more. She'd captured not just the business story but the human elements that made it compelling: the bootstrap funding approach, the early rejections from investors who didn't understand our vision, the late nights and ramen dinners that had sustained us through the lean months. She'd quoted several of our clients praising DataPulse's impact on their operations, and she'd positioned the acquisition as validation of Austin's emerging status as a major tech hub. But it was the final paragraph that made my chest tighten with emotion. Hartwell's success represents more than just a lucrative exit strategy. In a tech industry often criticized for prioritizing growth over impact, DataPulse Analytics demonstrates that profitable innovation can emerge from genuine problem-solving. As Hartwell puts it, we didn't set out to build a company that would make us rich. We set out to build something that would make our customers successful. The financial rewards followed naturally from that focus. David was grinning as he watched me read. It's already getting shared like crazy on LinkedIn and Twitter. This is going to be huge for Austin's tech. I looked around the ballroom, at the assembled representatives of Austin's traditional business establishment, and realized that something fundamental had shifted. These people understood Forbes. They respected the validation that came with national business media coverage. Whatever skepticism they'd harbored about my computer company was being rapidly recalculated in light of this third-party endorsement. My father appeared at my shoulder as if summoned by some invisible signal, his expression carefully neutral as he extended his hand toward David's phone. I watched him read the article with the same focused attention he brought to oil and gas reports, his eyes moving methodically through each paragraph. When he finished, he handed the phone back to David and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the dinner conversation around us. "I was wrong about what you were building." The words hung between us like a bridge spanning 3 years of silence and misunderstanding. Part of me wanted to savor this moment, to let him feel the full weight of his miscalculation. But another part, the part that remembered fishing trips and bedtime stories, felt only sadness for the time we'd lost. "You couldn't have known," I said finally. "This industry moves fast, and the metrics are different from what you're used to." He shook his head, his jaw tight with what I recognized as Hartwell's stubbornness. "That's not an excuse. I should have trusted your judgment instead of dismissing something I didn't understand." The conversation was interrupted by the evening's program, but the words stayed with me as speakers praised Austin's business community and celebrated the year's achievement. When they called my name to recognize DataPulse's acquisition, the applause was genuine and sustained, a far cry from the polite tolerance I'd experienced at previous events. But the real vindication came later, as the evening wound down and guests began to drift toward the exit. Patricia approached me with tears in her eyes, her composure finally cracking after hours of careful social navigation. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. What you've accomplished is extraordinary." The drive home through Austin's quiet streets gave me time to process everything that had happened. The city lights reflected off Lady Bird Lake like scattered diamonds, and I could see the glow of downtown's tech corridor, where companies like mine were reshaping Austin's economic landscape. My phone buzzed constantly with congratulatory messages from colleagues, clients, and former classmates who'd seen the Forbes article, but it was the text from my father that stopped me cold. "I should have believed in you from the beginning. I'm sorry it took Forbes to open my eyes. Can we have dinner next week? I'd like to hear about your plans for the future." I set the phone aside without responding, needing time to think about what forgiveness meant, and whether bridges once burned could ever be fully rebuilt. The acquisition was just the beginning of a new chapter, not the end of an old story. There would be new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the girl who'd maxed out credit cards to fund a dream had been right all along. As I pulled into my parking garage, I touched the compass pendant at my throat and smiled. My grandfather would have been proud, not just of the financial success, but of the way I'd stayed true to my vision even when the winds tried to blow me off course. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving others wrong, it's proving yourself right. The morning after the gala brought an unexpected deluge of attention. My phone started buzzing before dawn with calls from local news stations, tech blogs, and business publications wanting to follow up on the Forbes story. The acquisition had struck a nerve in Austin's entrepreneurial community, representing validation for the bootstrap approach that many local founders had embraced out of necessity rather than choice. I ignored most of the media requests, focusing instead on the mountain of due diligence documents that Technova Solutions required for the final closing. Leah arrived at the office early, her usual morning coffee replaced by what appeared to be her fifth energy drink of the day. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of another sleepless night spent optimizing our codebase for the technical review that would determine whether our $8 million valuation was justified. "Please tell me you have good news," she said, collapsing into the chair across from my desk. "Because I just spent 12 hours explaining to their engineers why our algorithm performs better than anything currently on the market, and I'm starting to question my own sanity." I laughed despite the stress that had been building in my chest since I'd woken up. "The Forbes piece is getting more traction than we expected. David says 3 other companies have reached out asking if we're open to competing offers." Leah's eyebrows shot up. "Serious? Are we considering it?" "No. Technova was our first choice for a reason. They understand what we've built, and they have the infrastructure to scale it properly. Plus, backing out now would torpedo our reputation in the Austin tech scene." But even as I said the words, I felt the weight of second-guessing that comes with any major decision. The Forbes article had positioned DataPulse as a David versus Goliath story, the scrappy startup that had succeeded through innovation rather than venture capital funding. The narrative was compelling, but it also created pressure to live up to an image that felt larger than our actual accomplishments. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father's world suddenly found our success interesting now that it had been validated by national media. Since the gala, I'd received LinkedIn messages from Austin Business Journal reporters, invitations to speak at local entrepreneur events, and even a request from the Austin Chamber of Commerce to join their technology advisory board. The same people who dismissed my company as a hobby were now eager to associate themselves with our success. Alex Thompson called just after lunch, his voice carrying the easy warmth that had first attracted me to him 6 months earlier. We'd met at a coffee shop near the university, where he was finishing his MBA, while working part-time for a nonprofit focused on digital literacy. Unlike the venture capitalists and tech executives who measured success in funding rounds and exit multiples, Alex understood that meaningful work often happened in quiet spaces without fanfare or recognition. "I saw the Forbes piece," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I'm proud of you, Zoe, not because of the money, but because you stayed true to what you wanted to build." "Thank you. That means more than you know. Are you free for dinner tonight? I know you're probably swamped with acquisition stuff, but I have something I want to show you." I glanced at my laptop screen, where emails from lawyers and accountants waited for responses that would determine the final terms of our deal with Technova. Part of me wanted to work through the night, to maintain the obsessive focus that had carried DataPulse from concept to acquisition target. But another part, the part that had learned to value relationships over revenue metrics, recognized that some moments couldn't be postponed. "I'll pick you up at 7, I said, already looking forward to a few hours away from spreadsheets and legal documents. Alex lived in a small house near Zilker Park, a neighborhood that had somehow managed to retain its bohemian character despite Austin's rapid gentrification. His front porch was cluttered with bike parts and gardening supplies, evidence of someone who preferred creating with his hands to consuming with his credit card. When I arrived, he was waiting on the steps with a picnic basket and a grin that made my stress level drop by half. "Where are we going?" I asked as he loaded the basket into my car. "You'll see, just drive toward the lake." We ended up at a small park overlooking Ladybird Lake, where the evening light painted the water in shades of gold and amber. Alex had packed sandwiches from our favorite deli, along with a bottle of wine and a thermos of coffee that he knew I'd need to stay functional. As we spread a blanket under a massive oak tree, I felt the tension of the past week beginning to ease. "I've been thinking about what you said at the gala," Alex said as we watched kayakers paddle past in the distance, "about proving yourself to people who never believed in you." I took a sip of wine, savoring the momentary peace that came from being away from phones and laptops and the constant pressure of decision-making. "What about it? I think you've been measuring success by the wrong metric. The Forbes article, the acquisition, your father's approval, those are all external validations. But you built DataPulse because you wanted to solve real problems for real people. That mission hasn't changed just because Technova is writing you a big check." His words hit closer to home than I'd expected. Over the past few months, As acquisition talks had intensified and media attention had grown, I'd found myself thinking more about exit strategies than customer impact. The $8 million valuation was undeniably exciting, but it had also shifted my focus from building something meaningful to maximizing something valuable. I used to know exactly why I was doing this, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Now I sometimes feel like I'm playing a game whose rules I don't fully understand. Alex reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a manila folder, his expression suddenly serious. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you tonight. I've been working on something for the past few months, and I think you're the only person who might understand it. Inside the folder were detailed plans for a nonprofit organization focused on providing data analytics tools to small businesses and community organizations that couldn't afford enterprise software solutions. The business model was elegant in its simplicity. Successful companies would sponsor licenses for underserved communities, creating a sustainable funding mechanism while democratizing access to sophisticated analytical tools. It's called Data Bridge, Alex explained as I studied the document. The idea is to take the same technology that's making DataPulse valuable to large companies and adapt it for organizations that are trying to make a difference in their communities. Food banks tracking inventory, homeless shelters managing resources, small nonprofits measuring their impact. I stared at the plans, feeling a mixture of excitement and recognition that reminded me of my earliest conversations with Leah about DataPulse's potential. This was the kind of work that had originally motivated me to leave ExxonMobil's corporate track, the belief that technology could level playing fields rather than simply creating new advantages for those who already had them. This is incredible, I said, and meant. Have you thought about how you'd fund the development? That's where I was hoping you might have some ideas. I know you're about to be very busy with the acquisition, but I thought maybe DataPulse could be a founding sponsor, or maybe you'd consider advising the project. The proposal came at exactly the moment when I'd been questioning my own motivations, and I realized that Alex had probably planned it that way. He understood better than anyone the internal conflict I'd been feeling about success and purpose, about the difference between building something valuable and building something meaningful. Let me think about it, I said, though part of me had already decided. There might be a way to structure this as part of the Technova deal. They're interested in corporate social responsibility initiatives, and this could be exactly the kind of program that differentiates them from their competitor. We spent the rest of the evening refining the data bridge concept, sketching out implementation timelines and partnership strategies on napkins while the sun set over Ladybird Lake. For the first time in months, I felt the kind of creative excitement that had sustained me through DataPulse's early days, the sense that we were solving problems that mattered rather than simply generating returns for investors. The drive home took us through downtown Austin, where the tech corridor buzzed with the energy of late-night coding sessions and startup dreams. I could see lights burning in office windows, evidence of other entrepreneurs wrestling with the same questions that had kept me awake for 3 years. How do you balance idealism with pragmatism? How do you build something sustainable without losing sight of why you started? When I finally made it back to my apartment, I found a voicemail from my father waiting on my phone. His voice carried a tentative quality I'd never heard before, as if he were navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. "Zoe, it's Dad. I wanted to follow up on my text about dinner. I know we have a lot to talk about, and I realize it might take time for you to trust that I've changed my perspective. But I'd like to try. If you're willing, maybe we could start with coffee instead of dinner. Something less formal. Call me when you have a chance." I set the phone aside without returning the call, not because I was angry but because I needed time to process what reconciliation might look like. The Forbes article had forced him to confront his assumptions about my capabilities, but rebuilding a relationship would require more than acknowledging past mistakes. It would require him to accept that I'd built something he didn't fully understand, and that my definition of success might never align with his traditional metrics. The next morning brought news that shifted everything once again. Victoria Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics and one of Austin's most respected business leaders, called my office directly rather than going through our usual channels. I'd met Victoria briefly at industry events, but we'd never worked together directly. Her company specialized in logistics optimization for manufacturing companies, exactly the kind of enterprise client that DataPulse had been designed to serve. "Zoe, I hope you don't mind me calling directly," she said, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucracy. "I read the Forbes piece, and I wanted to talk to you before your acquisition closes." "Of course. What can I do for you?" "I've been following DataPulse's development for the past year, and I'm interested in discussing a potential partnership, but more than that, I think you should know that your father has been reaching out to several Austin business leaders about investing in your company." The words hit me like cold water. "I'm sorry, what?" "Richard contacted me last week asking if I'd be interested in participating in a funding round for DataPulse. He seemed to think you were still raising capital, and he wanted to organize a group of local investors to support your expansion. I told him I'd need to speak with you directly, which is why I'm calling." I stared out my office window at the Austin skyline, trying to process this unexpected development. My father was attempting to invest in the company he'd once called a complete failure, apparently without bothering to inform me that the company was no longer seeking investors. The gesture felt both touching and presumptuous, evidence of his inability to understand that his support might no longer be necessary or welcome. "Victoria, I appreciate you calling me directly. DataPulse isn't raising capital. We're being acquired by Technova Solutions, and the deal should close within the next few weeks." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I see. Well, that explains why your father seemed confused when I mentioned the acquisition rumors. He apparently wasn't aware of the Technova deal." The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Victoria expressing interest in partnering with Technova on future projects. But my attention had drifted to the larger implications of what she'd revealed. My father was trying to support my company in the only way he knew how, through financial investment and business connections. But his approach revealed a fundamentals understanding of where DataPulse stood and what kind of support might actually be meaningful. After I hung up with Victoria, I sat in my office trying to decide how to handle this unexpected development. Part of me was touched that my father wanted to help, even if his methods were misguided. But another part was frustrated by his assumption that I needed his intervention, that my success required validation from his network of traditional business contacts. Leah appeared in my doorway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd overheard enough of my phone conversation to know that something significant had happened. "Let me guess," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Family drama is complicating the acquisition somehow." I filled her in on Victoria's call and my father's apparent attempt to organize investment in a company that was no longer seeking investors. Leah listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from amusement to concern as the full implications became clear. "So what are you going to do?" she asked finally. "I don't know. Part of me wants to call him and explain that we don't need his help, but another part thinks maybe this is his way of trying to make amends, even if he's going about it completely wrong. Or maybe," Leah said carefully, "this is his way of trying to insert himself into your success now that it's become undeniable. Some people can't stand being left out of something they once dismissed." Her words stung because they forced me to confront a possibility I'd been avoiding. Was my father's sudden interest in supporting DataPulse genuine, or was it motivated by a desire to claim partial credit for our success? The timing certainly suggested the latter, coming immediately after the Forbes article had established our credibility in Austin's business community. The question consumed my thoughts for the rest of the day, distracting me from acquisition paperwork and strategic planning sessions with Technova's integration team. When Alex called that evening to check on me, I found myself explaining the situation with more emotion than I'd intended. "It sounds like he's trying to fix something that can't be fixed with money," Alex said after I'd finished venting my frustration. "Maybe the real question isn't whether to accept his help, but whether you're ready to have an honest conversation about what happened between you." "I'm not sure I am ready. For 3 years I've been motivated partly by wanting to prove him wrong. Now that I have, I don't know what comes next. Maybe what comes next is figuring out whether you want a relationship with him that isn't defined by your professional success." The Forbes article proved you don't need his approval to build something meaningful, but that doesn't mean you can't choose to include him in your life if you want to. That night, I lay awake thinking about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between accepting an apology and rebuilding trust. My father's attempt to organize investment in DataPulse was clumsy and misguided, but it was also evidence that he was trying to connect with my world in the only way he knew how. The question was whether I was willing to teach him a better way. The decision crystallized the next morning when I received a text from Marcus, my older brother, whom I hadn't spoken to since the disaster at my mother's birthday dinner. His message was brief but loaded with family history. Dad told me about the Forbes article. I stared at the text for several minutes before responding. Marcus had always been the diplomatic one in our family, the peacemaker who tried to smooth over conflicts rather than address their underlying causes. If he was reaching out, it meant the situation had escalated beyond my father's ability to handle it alone. "Are you free for lunch?" I typed back, then immediately regretted the impulse. But before I could delete the message, my phone buzzed with his response. "Today? How about you, Chico, at noon?" The restaurant choice was typically Marcus, expensive enough to signal serious conversation, public enough to prevent emotional outbursts, and neutral territory that didn't favor either of our usual haunts. I agreed to meet him, then spent the rest of the morning preparing for a conversation I'd been avoiding for 3 years. Marcus arrived at the restaurant before I did, already seated at a corner table where we could talk without being overheard. He'd aged well since I'd last seen him, his success as a corporate attorney evident in his custom-tailored suit and confident bearing, but there was something tentative in his expression as he stood to greet me, evidence that this conversation would be as difficult for him as it was for me. "You look good," he said as we settled into our seats. "Success agrees with you, thank you. How are Sarah and the kids?" We spent the first few minutes catching up on safe topics: his family, my work, the Austin real estate market that was pricing out everyone except tech executives and oil barons. But eventually the conversation turned to the reason we were there. "Dad is struggling with how to approach you," Marcus said, his voice careful and measured. "He knows he made mistakes, but he doesn't know how to fix them. The investment thing was his attempt to show support, but he realizes now that it was inappropriate." I sipped my water, buying time to organize my thoughts. "Marcus, I appreciate that he wants to make amends, but I need you to understand something. For 3 years I've built DataPulse without his support or approval. I've proven that I can succeed on my own terms. I don't need his investment or his business connections. I know that. We all know that now, but he's still your father, Zoe. He still loves you, even if he has a terrible way of showing it." The words hung between us like a challenge. I knew Marcus was right about our father's love, but I also knew that love without respect was insufficient foundation for any relationship, family or other. Richard Hartwell loved the idea of his successful daughter, but I wasn't sure he respected the woman who'd built that success through methods he didn't understand. "What does he want from me?" I asked finally. "I think he wants a chance to know you as an adult, to understand what you've built and why it matters, to be proud of you for the right reasons instead of just being impressed by the Forbes article." The honesty in Marcus's voice surprised. He was acknowledging something that we'd all avoided discussing, that our father's love had always come with conditions, and that his pride had always been tied to achievements he could quantify and understand. DataPulse's success had forced him to confront the limitations of his own perspective, but changing perspective was different from changing character. "I'll think about it," I said, and Marcus nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished his mission. "That's all anyone can ask. And Zoe, for what it's worth, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Not because of the money, but because you had the courage to bet on yourself when nobody else would." The drive back to the office took me through the heart of Austin's tech corridor, where glass towers housed the dreams and ambitions of thousands of entrepreneurs who'd come to Texas seeking something that Silicon Valley couldn't provide. The city had become a magnet for people who wanted to build meaningful companies without losing their souls to venture capital metrics and IPO timelines. DataPulse had been part of that movement, and our acquisition by Technova represented validation for the bootstrap approach that many Austin companies had embraced. But success brought its own complications, including the question of what came next for someone who'd achieved their primary goal before turning 30. When I arrived at the office, I found Leah deep in conversation with Nicole Parker, the Forbes reporter who'd written our profile. Nicole was back in Austin working on a follow-up story about the city's emerging tech ecosystem, and she'd stopped by to check on how the acquisition was progressing. "Perfect timing," Nicole said as I joined them in the conference room. "I was just asking Leah about your plans after the Technova deal closes. Any interest in sharing your thoughts on the record?" I glanced at Leah, who shrugged with the expression of someone who'd learned not to make media decisions for her business partner. The follow-up interview could be valuable for establishing my reputation as a thought leader in Austin's tech community, but it also meant committing to a narrative about my future before I'd fully decided what that future would look like. "What kind of angle are you considering?" I asked. "I'm interested in the next generation of Austin entrepreneurs who are building companies with social impact missions. Your data bridge concept with Alex Thompson fits perfectly into that theme." I felt a jolt of surprise. "How do you know about data bridge?" Nicole smiled with the satisfaction of a reporter who'd uncovered an interesting story. "Alex reached out to me yesterday. He thought the nonprofit angle might be worth exploring, especially if DataPulse plans to be involved as a founding sponsor." The conversation that followed revealed how quickly ideas could gain momentum in Austin's interconnected business community. Alex had been networking the data bridge concept through his nonprofit contacts, several of whom had expressed interest in becoming pilot partners. Meanwhile, Nicole's follow-up story could provide the kind of media coverage that would help DataBridge attract additional sponsors and establish credibility with potential clients. "The narrative writes itself," Nicole explained as she packed up her record. "Successful entrepreneur uses acquisition proceeds to fund social impact initiatives. It's exactly the kind of story that Forbes readers love, especially when it demonstrates that profit and purpose can be aligned." After Nicole left, Leah and I spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the implications of committing to DataBridge as our next venture. The nonprofit would require significant time and energy, resources that would be stretched thin as we managed the Technova integration and fulfilled our contractual obligations to stay with the company for at least 2 years. But there was something compelling about the idea of building something that mattered more than revenue metrics. Something that could demonstrate the difference between success and significance. DataPulse had proven that we could build a valuable company. DataBridge would prove that we could build a meaningful one. The decision felt right in a way that pure profit maximization never had, and I realized that Alex had been correct about my motivation. I'd always been driven more by problem solving than profit seeking, and the acquisition had simply provided the resources to tackle bigger problems with more sophisticated solutions. As the sun set over Austin's skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of gold and amber, I made a mental note to call Alex and tell him that DataBridge had just gained its first major sponsor. Some opportunities were too important to postpone, and some partnerships were too valuable to risk losing. The next morning would bring new challenges and new decisions, but tonight I felt the satisfaction that comes from knowing your next chapter will be worth reading. Sometimes the greatest success isn't proving others wrong, it's proving yourself capable of something even better than what you originally imagined. The Technova integration timeline accelerated faster than anyone had anticipated. What started as a projected 3-month transition suddenly compressed into 6 weeks when their quarterly earnings call revealed a significant gap in their analytics portfolio. Our due diligence process shifted from methodical review to urgent validation as Technova's executive team realized that DataPulse could fill a crucial market position ahead of their competitor. I found myself spending 14-hour days in conference rooms, filled with lawyers, accountants, and technology consultants who spoke in acronyms and measured success in basis points. The excitement of being acquired was gradually replaced by the grinding reality of corporate integration, where every decision required approval from multiple stakeholders who'd never built anything from scratch. Leah thrived in this environment, her technical expertise making her invaluable to Technova's engineering teams who were trying to understand how our algorithms achieved superior performance with minimal computational overhead. She spent her days whiteboarding complex mathematical concepts while I navigated the business side of the transaction, ensuring that our team would be protected and our technology would be implemented correctly. The stress was beginning to show on both of us. Leah had developed a nervous habit of checking her phone every few minutes, waiting for the next urgent request from Technova's technical reviewers. I'd started grinding my teeth at night, waking up with a sore jaw and the persistent feeling that I was forgetting something important. It was during one of these marathon due diligence sessions that David Kim appeared in our conference room with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who'd been watching us work ourselves into exhaustion. "You both look terrible," he said, settling into an empty chair and sliding the coffee across the table. "When was the last time either of you went home before midnight?" I tried to remember and realized I couldn't. The past 2 weeks had blurred together in a haze of legal documents and financial projections, punctuated by brief naps on the office couch and meals ordered from whatever restaurant would deliver to our building after hours. "Technova wants to accelerate the closing," Leah explained, her voice hoarse from explaining technical specifications to people who measured software quality by the number of features rather than the elegance of implementation. "Their Q3 numbers were disappointing, and they need our platform integrated before the next earnings call." David frowned, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching alarm. "Zoe, you need to be careful here. When buyers start pushing for accelerated timelines, it usually means they're under pressure from their own stakeholders. That pressure gets passed down to acquired companies in ways that aren't always pleasant." His warning proved prescient. The next morning, I received a call from Jennifer Walsh, Technova's head of strategic acquisitions, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss timeline optimization opportunities. The corporate euphemism set off alarm bells, but I agreed to meet at their downtown Austin office. Technova occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower that showcased the kind of aggressive growth that venture capital funding could produce. Their lobby featured awards and accolades arranged like trophies, evidence of a company that measured success through external validation rather than internal satisfaction. Jennifer's office overlooked Lady Bird Lake, but the windows were tinted dark enough to block most of the natural light. "Zoe, thank you for coming on short notice," Jennifer said, gesturing toward a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "I wanted to discuss some adjustments to our integration timeline." The conversation that followed revealed Technova's true motivations for acquiring DataPulse. They weren't primarily interested in our technology or our team. They needed our customer relationships and market position to compete with a rival company that was gaining ground in the enterprise analytics space. Our $8 million valuation was less about what we'd built than about what we could help them defend. "We'd like to accelerate customer migrations to our platform," Jennifer explained, showing me a timeline that compressed our projected 2-year integration into 8 months. "Our technical teams believe they can replicate your core functionality within our existing infrastructure, which would allow us to sunset your platform ahead of schedule." I stared at the timeline, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. They were proposing to essentially dismantle DataPulse, absorbing our customers while discarding the technology and approach that had made us successful. Our team would be reassigned to other projects, and the platform we'd spent 3 years building would disappear into Technova's corporate structure. "This wasn't part of our original agreement," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the anger building in my chest. "The original agreement included provisions for timeline adjustments based on business needs," Jennifer replied, her tone carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "We're not changing the financial terms, just the implementation approach." But they were changing everything that mattered. The careful integration plan that would have preserved DataPulse's unique capabilities was being replaced by a corporate assimilation that would eliminate everything distinctive about our platform. Our customers would lose access to the personalized analytics that had made us valuable, and our team would be scattered across Technova's various divisions. I spent the drive back to our office trying to process what I'd learned. The acquisition I'd thought would validate everything we'd built was actually designed to destroy it, turning DataPulse into nothing more than a customer list and a revenue stream. The $8 million felt less like a reward for innovation than like a buyout to eliminate competition. Leah was waiting in my office when I returned, her laptop open to a technical architecture document that looked like it had been marked up by a dozen different reviewers. She took one look at my expression and closed the laptop. "Bad news." I filled her in on Jennifer's proposal, watching her expression shift from confusion to anger to something approaching despair. DataPulse hadn't just been our company. It had been our life's work, the tangible proof that we could build something meaningful and successful. Watching it get absorbed into Technova's corporate machinery felt like watching a work of art get fed into a paper shredder. "Can we back out?" Leah asked finally, not without significant financial penalty. "We've already signed the letter of intent, and Technova has invested substantial resources in due diligence. Breaking the deal now would expose us to breach of contract claims that could bankrupt us personally." We sat in silence for several minutes, contemplating the gap between expectation and reality that seemed to define every major milestone in entrepreneurial life. Success rarely looked like what you'd imagined, and the price of achievement often included sacrificing the very things that had motivated you to achieve it. The sound of my phone buzzing broke the silence. My father's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in weeks, I actually wanted to talk to him. Richard Hartwell had navigated dozens of acquisitions and mergers during his career, and despite our complicated relationship, his experience might provide valuable perspective. "Dad," I answered, surprising both myself and Leah with the informality of the greeting. "Zoe, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about dinner, but I also heard through the business community that Technova is accelerating your acquisition timeline." Austin's business networks were apparently more efficient than I'd realized. News of our accelerated closing had already reached my father's circle, probably through the same channels that had alerted him to our original Forbes coverage. "Where did you hear that?" "Jennifer Walsh's father is a member of the Austin Country Club. He mentioned that Technova was prioritizing your acquisition to strengthen their Q4 performance. I wanted to make sure you had good legal representation for the close." The gesture was typically Richard Hartwell practical support offered without emotional context, help provided through professional networks rather than personal relationships. But coming after months of silence and misunderstanding, even his business-focused concern felt like progress. "We have good lawyers," I said, "but I appreciate you checking. Zoe, I know our relationship has been strained, and I take responsibility for that, but if you're facing pressure from Technova to modify your deal terms, I want you to know that you have options. There are other buyers in this market, and your success gives you negotiating leverage that you might not realize." His words carried the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years structuring complex business deals, and I found myself actually listening to his advice rather than dismissing it as unwanted interference. Richard Hartwell might not understand technology, but he understood corporate behavior and the dynamics of acquisition negotiations. "What kind of options?" "Well, for starters, you could use competing interest to strengthen your position with Technova. If they know that other companies are evaluating DataPulse, they'll be less likely to demand concessions that damage your platform's value." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with my father walking me through negotiation strategies that I'd never encountered during business school or startup accelerator program. His advice was practical and specific, drawing on decades of experience with corporate acquisitions that had succeeded and failed for predictable reasons. When I hung up, Leah was staring at me with an expression of bemused surprise. "Did your father just give you useful business advice?" "I think he did, and I think I'm actually going to follow it." The next step was reconnecting with the other companies that had expressed interest in DataPulse following our Forbes coverage. David Kim had mentioned 3 potential buyers, and Nicole Parker's follow-up story had generated additional inquiries from companies looking to strengthen their analytics capability. Creating a competitive dynamic wouldn't necessarily change Technova's integration plans, but it might give us leverage to negotiate better terms for our team and our customer. The first call I made was to Victoria Sterling, whose company had been exploring data analytics solutions for their logistics optimization platform. Victoria's interest in DataPulse was strategic rather than defensive. She wanted to integrate our capabilities into Sterling Dynamics' existing operations, rather than simply acquiring our customer base. "I'm intrigued by your timing," Victoria said when I explained our situation. "Technova's reputation in the market is solid, but they're known for aggressive integration strategies that don't always preserve the unique value of acquired companies." Her words confirmed what I'd suspected about Technova's motivation. They were buying DataPulse to eliminate competition and capture revenue, not to preserve the innovation that had made us valuable in the first place. Victoria's approach would be different, slower, more thoughtful, focused on leveraging our capabilities rather than replacing them. What would your integration timeline look like? I asked. 18 to 24 months, with your team maintaining autonomy over platform development. We'd want to integrate DataPulse's analytics into our logistics platform, but we'd preserve your existing customer relationships and continue developing your core technology. The contrast with Technova's approach was stark. Victoria was proposing true integration rather than corporate assimilation, a partnership that would preserve everything valuable about DataPulse, while providing resources for accelerated growth. The financial terms would probably be lower than Technova's offer, but the long-term value creation could be significantly higher. Over the next 3 days, I conducted similar conversations with 2 other potential buyers, each offering different approaches to integration and growth. The exercise wasn't designed to replace Technova, but to understand our alternatives and strengthen our negotiating position. By Friday afternoon, I had enough information to request a follow-up meeting with Jennifer Wall. This time I brought Leah and David Kim to the meeting, along with a folder containing alternative offer summaries and integration proposals. Jennifer's demeanor shifted perceptibly when she realized that we'd been exploring other options, her corporate politeness replaced by something approaching wariness. I thought we had an exclusive arrangement, she said, scanning the documents I'd placed on her conference table. We have a letter of intent with specific terms and conditions, I replied. When you proposed material changes to those terms, it seemed prudent to evaluate our alternatives. The conversation that followed was tense but productive. Jennifer quickly realized that DataPulse's value in the market was higher than Technova had initially calculated, and that losing the acquisition to a competitor would be more damaging than preserving our platform's unique capability. By the end of the meeting, we'd negotiated a revised integration plan that protected our team's autonomy and maintained our customer relationships. The compromise wasn't perfect, but it represented a significant improvement over Technova's original assimilation strategy. Our platform would remain independent for at least 18 months, giving us time to prove that preservation was more valuable than elimination. The financial terms remained unchanged, but the operational terms shifted dramatically in our favor. Walking back to our office through downtown Austin's late afternoon heat, I felt the kind of satisfaction that comes from successful negotiation, rather than successful capitulation. The acquisition would still happen, but on terms that preserved what mattered most about what we'd built. Your father was right, Leah observed as we waited for an elevator in our building. Having alternatives gave us leverage we wouldn't have had otherwise. I know, I should probably call and thank him. But when I tried to call Richard that evening, the conversation that resulted was more complex than simple gratitude. My father's business advice had been valuable, but it had also highlighted the distance that remained between us. He could help me navigate corporate negotiations, but he still didn't fully understand what DataPulse represented or why preserving it mattered to me. I'm glad the meeting went well, he said after I'd summarized our revised agreement with Techno. Jennifer Walsh is known for being tough but fair. You should be able to work with her. Dad, can I ask you something? Do you understand what DataPulse actually does? There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to confirm what I'd suspect. Despite his willingness to help with business strategy, my father still didn't grasp the technical innovation that had made our platform successful. He saw DataPulse as a valuable asset, but not as a meaningful solution to real problems. I understand that you've built something valuable, he said finally, and I understand that you're passionate about it. That's what matters to me. The admission was both touching and insufficient. Richard Hartwell was trying to support me without fully comprehending what I'd accomplished, offering relationship without requiring understanding. It was progress, but not the kind of recognition I'd spent 3 years hoping to earn. I'd like to show you what we've built, I said impulsive. Would you be interested in visiting our office sometime? I could walk you through the platform and explain how it works. I'd like that very much. The conversation ended with tentative plans for my father to visit DataPulse the following week, before the acquisition closing consumed all of my time and attention. It would be the first time he'd seen our office or met our team, the first opportunity for him to understand what I'd been building while he'd been dismissing it as a hobby. That weekend, Alex and I spent Saturday morning refining the data bridge proposal, incorporating feedback from potential nonprofit partners and developing a more sophisticated funding model. The project had evolved from a simple idea into a comprehensive platform that could serve hundreds of community organizations across Texas and beyond. "I've been thinking about your father's offer to invest in DataPulse," Alex said as we worked through financial projections on my laptop. "Maybe there's a way to redirect that energy toward DataBridge instead." The suggestion was intriguing. Richard Hartwell's investment interest might have been misguided, but his willingness to support my work represented a genuine shift in perspective. DataBridge would be exactly the kind of socially responsible initiative that could appeal to his desire to contribute to meaningful projects. "He's coming to the office next week," I said. "Maybe I'll mention DataBridge and see how he responds. Just remember that this needs to be your decision, not his. DataBridge works because it aligns with your values and priorities. Don't let family dynamics compromise that." Alex's caution was well-founded. My father's support came with expectations and assumptions that might not align with DataBridge's mission, but it also represented an opportunity to build a relationship based on shared values, rather than competing priorities. The following Monday brought our team's final week as an independent company. Technova's integration specialists had arrived in Austin to begin the technical transition process, while lawyers on both sides worked through the remaining legal details that would formalize our acquisition. The office buzzed with nervous energy as everyone processed the reality that our startup chapter was ending. I'd scheduled my father's visit for Wednesday afternoon, timing it to coincide with a team presentation that would showcase DataPulse's capabilities for Technova's management team. It seemed fitting that Richard Hartwell would finally see what I'd built at the same moment we were preparing to hand it over to someone else. When he arrived at our office, I was struck by how out of place he looked among our collection of mismatched furniture and whiteboard-covered walls. Richard Hartwell was accustomed to corporate environments where success was measured by square footage and designer accessories. Our startup aesthetic probably reinforced his perception that technology companies were inherently less serious than traditional businesses. But his expression shifted as I walked him through our platform, demonstrating how small businesses could use DataPulse to optimize inventory, predict customer behavior, and identify growth opportunities. For the first time, he saw our software solving real problems for real customers, creating value through innovation rather than simply generating revenue through transactions. "This is remarkable," he said after watching a live demonstration of how a local restaurant chain used our platform to reduce food waste and improve profit margins. "I had no idea that data could be used this way." The admission carried weight because it came from someone who'd built his fortune through careful analysis of market trends and resource allocation. Richard Hartwell understood the value of information, but he'd never seen technology that could democratize analytical capabilities for companies that couldn't afford enterprise consulting service. Leah joined us for the technical portion of the presentation, explaining how our algorithms achieved superior performance through innovative approaches to data processing and pattern recognition. My father asked thoughtful questions about scalability and competitive advantage, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that had made him successful in traditional industries. "What happens to this after Technova takes over?" he asked as we concluded the presentation. "That's still being determined," I said carefully. "Our platform will be integrated into their infrastructure, but the specific implementation approach is evolving." He nodded with the understanding of someone who'd navigated similar transitions. Acquisition integrations are always more complex than they appear on paper. The acquiring company gets the assets, but they don't always get the knowledge or culture that made those assets valuable. His observation was perceptive and somewhat troubling. Technova was acquiring DataPulse's technology and customer relationships, but they might struggle to preserve the innovative culture and collaborative approach that had made our platform successful. Corporate integration often involved standardizing processes and consolidating teams in ways that eliminated the creative tension necessary for continued innovation. As we wrapped up the office visit, I mentioned DataBridge and Alex's proposal to create a nonprofit analytics platform for community organizations. My father's response surprised me with its immediacy and enthusiasm. "That's exactly the kind of project that should be funded," he said. "Community organizations need access to sophisticated tools, but they're typically priced out of enterprise software markets. If DataPulse can solve that problem, it could have significant social impact. The conversation continued over dinner at a small restaurant near the office, where my father offered to help fund DataBridge's initial development and to connect the project with other Austin business leaders who might be interested in supporting social impact initiatives. His offer was genuine and generous, but it also came with the implicit expectation that he would have ongoing involvement in the project's direction. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but Alex and I want to make sure that DataBridge remains true to its original mission. We're not looking for investors who want to influence strategic decisions. Of course, I understand that. I'm offering to be a sponsor, not a partner. The decision-making would remain with you and Alex." The distinction was important, and I found myself actually considering his proposal. Richard Hartwell's business connections could accelerate DataBridge's development and increase its potential impact, but accepting his support would also mean nagging family dynamics that had already proven complicated and unpredictable. "Let me discuss it with Alex and get back to you," I said, and my father nodded with the patience of someone who'd learned not to pressure outcomes he couldn't control. The drive home took me through Austin's tech corridor, where office buildings glowed with the light of late-night coding sessions and entrepreneurial dreams. In 48 hours, DataPulse would officially become part of Technova's corporate structure, and my role would shift from founder to employee. The financial rewards were substantial, but the emotional transition was more complex than I'd anticipated. Change, I was learning, always came with costs that couldn't be calculated in advance. The $8 million acquisition had validated everything I'd built, but it had also forced me to confront questions about purpose and identity that success alone couldn't answer. Sometimes the greatest challenge wasn't proving yourself capable of achievement, but figuring out what achievement actually meant. The next morning brought final contract signatures and wire transfer confirmations that would make the acquisition official by close of business. Leah and I spent the day reviewing integration timelines and organizational charts that would define our roles within Technova's structure. The transition felt both momentous and anticlimactic, like reaching a summit only to discover that the real journey lay on the other side of the mountain. But as I signed the final documents that would transform DataPulse from independent startup to corporate subsidiary, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial returns. We'd built something meaningful that would continue solving problems for customers who needed sophisticated tools to compete in increasingly complex markets. The platform's future might be uncertain, but its impact was already established and would outlast any corporate reorganization. The celebration that evening was deliberately low-key, just our core team gathering at a local restaurant to acknowledge the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The mood was reflective rather than euphoric, tinged with the bittersweet recognition that successful exits often feel more like endings than achievement. As I looked around the table at the people who'd helped transform DataPulse from concept to acquisition target, I realized that the greatest success hadn't been proving my father wrong or achieving financial independence. It had been building something valuable with people who shared my commitment to solving meaningful problems through innovative solutions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, including decisions about DataBridge that could define the next phase of my professional life. But tonight, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've built something worth building, regardless of what comes next. The Technova acquisition officially closed on a Thursday morning that felt deceptively ordinary. I sat in a sterile conference room surrounded by lawyers and executives, signing documents that transferred ownership of 3 years of my life to a corporation that measured success in quarterly earnings report. The wire transfer confirmation arrived at 11:47 a.m., marking the moment when DataPulse ceased to exist as an independent entity and I became $8 million wealthier. The number felt abstract, like a statistic from someone else's life. $8 million was more money than I'd ever imagined having, but it also represented the end of something that had defined my identity since leaving ExxonMobil's corporate track. I was no longer Zoe Hartwell, startup founder. I was Zoe Hartwell, former startup founder, and the distinction carried psychological weight I hadn't anticipated. Leah seemed to be processing the transition more easily than I was. She'd already started working with Technova's engineering teams on platform integration, diving into technical challenges with the same enthusiasm she'd brought to our original development work. For her, the acquisition was simply a new chapter in the same story, with better resources and larger-scale opportunity. "You're overthinking this," she said as we cleared out our old office space, packing 3 years of whiteboards and prototypes into boxes that would either be shipped to Technova's headquarters or donated to local entrepreneurship program. "We built something amazing. We got paid what it was worth. And now we get to build something even better with more resources." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been lost in the translation from independent startup to corporate subsidiary. The acquisition had preserved our technology and our team, but it had changed the fundamental nature of what we were doing. We were no longer solving problems because we believed they needed solving. We were solving problems because they aligned with Technova's strategic objectives and quarterly revenue targets. The realization crystallized during my first week as a Technova employee, when Jennifer Walsh scheduled a meeting to discuss my integration timeline and role definition. Her office hadn't changed since our negotiation sessions, but my relationship to the space was completely different. I was no longer a founder negotiating from a position of strength. I was an employee receiving assignments from a manager who controlled my professional future. "We'd like you to focus on client retention during the transition period," Jennifer explained, sliding an organizational chart across her desk. "Your relationships with DataPulse's original customers will be crucial for maintaining revenue continuity while we complete the platform integration." The assignment was logical and important, but it reduced me from strategic decision-maker to relationship manager. Instead of building new capabilities or exploring innovative applications, I would spend my time reassuring existing customers that their analytics needs would continue to be met, despite fundamental changes to the underlying technology. "What about new product development?" DataPulse had a roadmap for expanding into predictive analytics and machine learning applications. "Those initiatives will be handled by our existing product development team. We have experienced groups that specialize in those areas, and it makes sense to leverage their expertise rather than duplicating capabilities." Translation: Technova didn't trust a 29-year-old former startup founder to make strategic decisions about product development. They'd acquired DataPulse for its customer base and market position, but they intended to integrate our technology into their existing development processes rather than preserving our innovative approaches. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Jennifer outlining reporting structures and performance metrics that would govern my role within Technova's hierarchy. Everything was professional and reasonable, but it felt like being fitted for a corporate straitjacket designed to contain entrepreneurial instincts that no longer served the organization's needs. When I left the meeting, I drove directly to Alex's house instead of returning to the Technova offices. I found him in his backyard workshop refinishing a dining table he'd rescued from a state. The physical work seemed to center him in a way that digital projects never could, and I envied his ability to create something tangible with his own hands. "How did the integration meeting go?" he asked, not looking up from the sandpaper that was slowly revealing the wood's natural grain. "About as well as expected. They want me to be a customer relations manager while their real teams handle the important work." Alex paused his sanding and looked at me with the direct gaze that had first attracted me to him. "So what are you going to do about it?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you just received $8 million for building something innovative and valuable. You have enough financial security to spend the rest of your career doing exactly what you want to do. Why are you worried about what Technova thinks about your role?" His question cut to the heart of my anxiety. The acquisition had solved my financial concerns, but it had also created new psychological pressures around identity and purpose. I'd spent 3 years defining myself as someone who built meaningful solutions to important problems. Now I was wealthy enough to pursue any opportunity, but unclear about what opportunities were worth pursuing. "I've been thinking about DataBridge," Alex continued, returning to his sanding with steady, methodical stroke. "We have interested nonprofit partners, potential corporate sponsors, and a clear mission that addresses real needs. The only thing we're missing is someone willing to commit the time and energy required to make it successful." The implication was obvious, but it still felt like a leap across a chasm I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. DataBridge represented everything I'd originally wanted to accomplish with DataPulse, democratizing access to sophisticated analytical tools for organizations that couldn't afford enterprise solutions. But it also meant walking away from the corporate security that the Technova acquisition had provided. What if DataBridge fails? I asked. What if we can't build a sustainable funding model, or find enough nonprofit partners to justify the development cost? Then we'll have failed while trying to solve problems that matter to us. That's better than succeeding at something that doesn't. His words stayed with me over the next few days as I navigated my new role within Technova's corporate structure. The work wasn't difficult or unpleasant, but it felt increasingly disconnected from the motivation that had driven me to start DataPulse. I was managing relationships and attending meetings rather than solving problems and building solutions. The contrast became particularly stark during a client retention call with Sarah Chen, the CEO of a regional nonprofit that provided financial literacy training to underserved communities. DataPulse had helped Sarah's organization track program effectiveness and optimize resource allocation, enabling them to serve more clients with their limited budget. I'm concerned about what this acquisition means for our partnership, Sarah said during our video call. DataPulse understood our constraints and worked with us to implement solutions that fit our budget and capabilities. Will Technova maintain that same level of support? The question was reasonable, but I didn't have a satisfactory answer. Technova's enterprise focus and corporate pricing structure weren't designed to accommodate small nonprofits with limited technology budgets. Sarah's organization was exactly the kind of client that might be deprioritized during the integration process, despite their innovative use of our platform. I'll make sure your concerns are communicated to the integration team, I said, though I suspected Sarah's organization would eventually be migrated to a lower-tier service package that provided less functionality at a higher relative cost. After the call ended, I sat in my new Technova office staring out at Austin's downtown skyline and thinking about the gap between corporate efficiency and mission-driven service. Sarah's organization was solving important problems with limited resources, but they didn't generate enough revenue to justify personalized attention from a large technology company. They needed exactly the kind of support that DataBridge was designed to provide. That evening, I called my father to discuss his offer to sponsor DataBridge's development. The conversation felt surreal, asking Richard Hartwell for support on a project that embodied everything he'd once dismissed about my career choice. But his enthusiasm for the nonprofit initiative seemed genuine, and his business connections could accelerate DataBridge's impact significantly. I've been thinking about our conversation, I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries about family and business. If your offer to support DataBridge is still open, I'd like to discuss it seriously. Of course it's still open. I think DataBridge could be exactly the kind of project that demonstrates technology's potential for social impact. When would you like to meet? We scheduled dinner for the following weekend, giving me time to develop a comprehensive presentation about DataBridge's mission, funding requirements, and potential impact. But as I prepared for the meeting, I found myself questioning whether I was ready to accept support from someone who'd spent 3 years dismissing my judgment and capability. The internal conflict came to a head during a team meeting with Technova's product development group, where Jennifer Walsh outlined plans for integrating DataPulse's functionality into their existing analytics suite. The technical approach was sound, but it eliminated many of the features that had made our platform particularly valuable for small and medium-sized businesses. What about clients who specifically need the customization capabilities we built into DataPulse? I asked during the presentation. Those features will be available through our enterprise tier, responded Kevin Martinez, Technova's head of product development. Organizations that require advanced customization can upgrade to access those capabilities, but the enterprise tier cost 5 times more than DataPulse's original pricing, effectively pricing out the small businesses and nonprofits that had been our core market. Technova was systematically eliminating the democratizing aspects of our platform in favor of features that would appeal to large corporations with substantial technology budgets. I spent the rest of the meeting thinking about Sarah Chen and dozens of other clients who'd used DataPulse to solve important problems with limited resources. They were about to lose access to tools that had become essential for their operations, not because the technology couldn't serve them, but because it wasn't profitable enough to justify corporate attention. The realization that I was complicit in this process felt like a weight settling in my chest. The $8 million I'd received for DataPulse represented compensation for helping Technova eliminate competition and consolidate market share. I'd been paid to participate in exactly the kind of corporate behavior that had originally motivated me to start an independent company. When I got home that evening, I found Alex waiting on my front porch with a bottle of wine and a folder full of documents. His expression was excited but cautious, as if he were carrying news that could either be wonderful or terrible depending on my response. "I have an update on DataBridge," he said as we settled into my living room. 3 more nonprofits have expressed interest in becoming pilot partners, and I received a call from the Austin Community Foundation about potential grant funding. The folder contained letters of intent from organizations across Texas that wanted to participate in DataBridge's pilot program. Food banks that needed better inventory tracking, homeless shelters that wanted to measure program effectiveness, environmental groups that required sophisticated data analysis for advocacy campaigns. Each organization represented exactly the kind of meaningful work that had originally inspired me to leave corporate security and start DataPulse. "There's something else," Alex said, pulling out a letter that bore the letterhead of the Austin Business Journal. "Nicole Parker wants to do a follow-up story about local entrepreneurs who are using acquisition proceeds to fund social impact initiatives." She specifically mentioned DataBridge as an example of how successful exits can enable community investment. The article would provide valuable publicity for DataBridge, but it would also commit me publicly to a path that I hadn't yet fully chosen. Once the story was published, backing away from the nonprofit initiative would be difficult without appearing to have abandoned a public commitment to social responsibility. "Alex, I need to be honest with you about something. I'm scared." He set down his wine glass and leaned forward, his expression shifting to serious attention. "I'm scared that DataBridge will fail and I'll have wasted the opportunity that DataPulse created. I'm scared that I'll disappoint people who are counting on us to solve problems that matter to them. And I'm scared that I'm not ready to walk away from corporate security to start something new." Alex was quiet for several minutes, considering my admission with the thoughtfulness that had made me trust him from our earliest conversations. "Do you remember why you started DataPulse?" he asked finally. "Because I wanted to democratize access to data analytics tools. And did you succeed?" "For a while, but Technova is systematically eliminating that democratization in favor of enterprise-focused features. So DataPulse accomplished its original mission until it was acquired by a company with different priorities. That's not failure, that's proof that your original instincts were correct. DataBridge is just the next iteration of the same mission." His words reframed my anxiety in a way that made the path forward clearer. DataBridge wasn't a departure from what I'd accomplished with DataPulse. It was a continuation of the same work, freed from the constraints of venture capital expectations and corporate acquisition pressure. "I want to do this," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I want to build DataBridge, and I want to do it right." Alex smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for me to reach that conclusion. "Then let's call your father and set up that sponsorship meeting. And let's tell Nicole Parker that we're ready for that follow-up story." The next morning, I submitted my resignation from Technova effective in 2 weeks, citing personal opportunities that required my full attention. Jennifer Walsh was surprised but not particularly concerned. My departure would simply accelerate their timeline for integrating DataPulse's customer relationships into their existing account management structure. "I hope this isn't about compensation or role definition," Jennifer said during our exit interview. "We'd be open to discussing adjustments if that would change your decision. It's not about money or position, it's about doing work that aligns with my values and priorities." She nodded with the polite incomprehension of someone who'd never experienced tension between professional success and personal satisfaction. For Jennifer, corporate advancement was its own reward, and the idea of walking away from security to pursue mission-driven work probably seemed like an expensive form of self-indulgence. But as I cleaned out my Technova office and said goodbye to colleagues who'd become friends during our brief integration period, I felt the kind of relief that comes from choosing authenticity over security. The $8 million in my bank account provided freedom to pursue opportunities that mattered to me, rather than opportunities that impressed other people. The meeting with my father took place the following Saturday at a small restaurant in Westlake Hills, chosen for its quiet atmosphere and private booths that would allow for extended conversation without interruption. Richard arrived early, already seated and reviewing what appeared to be a business plan when I approached his table. "I've been doing some research on nonprofit funding models," he said after we'd exchanged greetings and ordered lunch. "DataBridge has significant potential, but it will need sustainable revenue streams to achieve long-term impact." The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion we'd ever had about my professional goals. Instead of dismissing my plans or questioning my judgment, Richard engaged with DataBridge's mission and offered practical suggestions for organizational structure and funding strategy. His business experience provided valuable perspective on challenges I hadn't fully considered, while his network of Austin contacts could accelerate our ability to connect with potential sponsors and partners. "I'd like to make an initial contribution of $200,000, he said as we discussed funding requirements, "but more importantly, I'd like to help you connect with other Austin business leaders who might be interested in supporting this kind of social impact initiative." The offer was generous and practical, but it also represented something more significant than financial support. Richard was choosing to invest in my judgment and capabilities, trusting that I could build something meaningful with resources he was providing. After 3 years of skepticism and dismissal, his confidence felt like validation I hadn't realized I needed. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than he probably understood. "This will make a huge difference for our ability to launch effectively. Zoe, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Not just the financial success, but the way you've stayed committed to solving problems that matter to you. That takes courage that I'm not sure I had at your age." The admission was unexpected and emotionally complex. Richard Hartwell had built his fortune through careful calculation and strategic risk-taking, but he'd never pursued work that prioritized social impact over financial returns. His recognition that I was choosing a more difficult path carried weight precisely because it came from someone who understood the security I was choosing to abandon. When I got home that evening, I called Alex to share the news about my father's sponsorship commitment and his offer to facilitate additional connections. Alex's excitement was infectious, and we spent the next 2 hours refining DataBridge's development timeline and partnership strategy. "I have some news too," Alex said as our planning session wound down. "I gave my notice at the nonprofit yesterday. If we're going to do this, I want to do it with complete focus and commitment." His decision to leave stable employment for an unproven venture felt like the final confirmation that DataBridge was worth the risks we were taking. Neither of us had guarantees about the nonprofit's potential success, but we both believed that the mission justified the uncertainty. Over the next week, I worked with lawyers to establish DataBridge as a 501c3 organization, while Alex finalized agreements with our pilot nonprofit partner. The administrative work was tedious but necessary, creating the legal and organizational infrastructure that would enable us to accept funding and begin serving clients. The Austin Business Journal interview with Nicole Parker took place in the same coffee shop where I'd first explained DataPulse to potential customers 3 years earlier. The circular symmetry felt appropriate, returning to the place where I'd started my entrepreneurial journey to announce the next phase of that same mission. "What made you decide to walk away from corporate security to start another venture?" Nicole asked as her recorder captured our conversation. "I realized that success without purpose is just wealth accumulation. DataBridge gives me an opportunity to use what I learned building DataPulse to solve problems for organizations that are working to improve their community." The interview was scheduled to publish the following Monday, the same day that DataBridge would officially launch with our first pilot partners. The timing was deliberately symbolic. Public commitment to a mission that would define the next chapter of my professional life. But as I prepared for DataBridge's launch, I found myself thinking less about public recognition than about private satisfaction. The $8 million from DataPulse's acquisition had provided financial security, but it had also demonstrated that money alone couldn't provide the sense of purpose that made work meaningful. DataBridge represented a return to the motivations that had originally driven me to start DataPulse. The belief that technology could democratize access to sophisticated tools and enable organizations to solve important problems more effectively. The nonprofit model eliminated the pressure to prioritize revenue over impact, creating space to focus on outcomes that mattered beyond quarterly earnings report. The final preparation for DataBridge's launch took place in Alex's workshop, where we assembled care packages for our pilot partners containing training materials, technical support contact information, and personalized letters explaining our commitment to their success. The manual work felt grounding after months of corporate meetings and legal documentation, a reminder that meaningful innovation often happened through direct service rather than strategic planning. As we finished packaging the materials that would introduce DataBridge to its first clients, I felt the kind of nervous excitement that had characterized DataPulse's early days. The nonprofit had potential to create significant social impact, but it also represented a professional gamble that could fail despite our best intentions and most careful planning. "Are you ready for this?" Alex asked as we loaded the packages into my car for delivery the next morning. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for this kind of leap, but I'm ready to find out what we can build when we don't have to worry about investor returns or acquisition pressure." The drive home took me through Austin's tech corridor one more time, past the office buildings where DataPulse had evolved from concept to acquisition target. The city's entrepreneurial energy was as palpable as ever, evidence of countless other founders who were wrestling with the same questions about purpose and impact that had shaped my own journey. Tomorrow would bring DataBridge's official launch and the beginning of a new chapter in my relationship with both technology and social responsibility. The $8 million from DataPulse's acquisition had provided the freedom to pursue work that mattered to me, but it had also taught me that financial success without personal satisfaction was ultimately hollow. Sometimes the greatest achievement isn't proving yourself capable of wealth creation, but proving yourself capable of using that wealth to create something more meaningful than additional wealth. DataBridge would test whether I could translate the lessons learned from building a successful company into the skills required for building a successful mission. DataBridge's official launch arrived with Austin's first cold snap of the season, a crisp October morning that carried the promise of change in its sharp-edged air. I stood in our modest office space in East Austin, watching Alex conduct our inaugural training session with representatives from 6 nonprofit organizations who'd agreed to pilot our analytics platform. The contrast with DataPulse's corporate-focused origins couldn't have been stark. Maria Santos from the Central Texas Food Bank leaned forward as Alex demonstrated how DataBridge could optimize their inventory distribution across 14 regional partners. Her organization had been tracking food donations and distributions through a combination of spreadsheets and intuition, losing valuable resources to inefficient allocation patterns they couldn't identify without sophisticated analytical tools. "This could help us feed an additional 1,000 families per month," Maria said, her voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who understood that data analysis could translate directly into human welfare. "How quickly can we implement this across all our distribution centers?" The question embodied everything DataBridge was designed to achieve: sophisticated analytical capabilities, serving organizations whose missions extended far beyond profit maximization. Unlike DataPulse's corporate clients who measured success through revenue growth and market share expansion, our nonprofit partners tracked outcomes like families fed, children housed, and communities strengthened. James Rivera from Austin Homeless Services raised his hand during the technical demonstration. "Our current system can tell us how many people we've housed, but it can't predict which intervention strategies are most likely to achieve permanent housing outcome. Could DataBridge help us identify patterns that would improve our success rates?" Alex nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly the kind of predictive analytics we're designed to support. We can help you identify which combinations of services, timing, and individual characteristics correlate with the highest rates of sustainable housing placement." The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with each organization describing challenges that had frustrated their ability to maximize impact with limited resources. DataBridge wouldn't just provide analytical tools, it would enable mission-driven organizations to operate with the same data sophistication that had previously been available only to well-funded corporations. When the training session concluded, I felt the familiar satisfaction that had originally motivated me to leave ExxonMobil's corporate track. We were solving meaningful problems for people who were working to improve their communities, creating value that couldn't be measured solely through financial returns. The satisfaction was amplified by a phone call I received that afternoon from Jennifer Walsh at Technova. She was calling to discuss a potential partnership between DataBridge and Technova's corporate social responsibility initiatives, an opportunity that would provide significant funding in exchange for featuring our nonprofit work in their marketing material. "We're impressed by the media coverage DataBridge has generated," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the calculated enthusiasm of someone who'd identified a valuable public relations opportunity. "Partnering with your organization could demonstrate Technova's commitment to social impact while providing you with resources for expansion." The offer was financially attractive but strategically complicated. Technova's sponsorship would accelerate DataBridge's growth and increase our ability to serve additional nonprofit partners, but it would also create pressure to align our mission with their corporate objectives, potentially compromising the independence that made our work authentic and effective. "I appreciate the interest," I said carefully. "Let me discuss it with my team and board members before making any commitments." After hanging up, I walked to the window overlooking East Austin's rapidly evolving landscape. The neighborhood was changing with the same velocity that had transformed the city's tech sector, creating opportunities for innovation, while displacing communities that couldn't afford the increased cost of success. DataBridge existed partly to ensure that technological advancement would benefit organizations serving those displaced communities, rather than simply enriching the companies driving that advance. Alex joined me at the window holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the thoughtful expression that indicated he'd been processing complex decisions while I was on the phone. "Technova wants to sponsor us," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I figure the question is whether we want to be sponsored by them." His response captured the essential tension we'd been navigating since DataBridge's inception. Corporate sponsorship could accelerate our impact and expand our reach, but it could also constrain our ability to serve clients whose needs might conflict with sponsor interest. Independence was expensive, but it was also the foundation of our credibility with nonprofit partners who'd been burned by corporate initiatives that prioritized publicity over genuine support. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think we should be selective about our funding sources." Technova acquired DataPulse partly to eliminate competition and consolidate market share. Accepting their sponsorship could compromise our ability to serve organizations that might challenge their business practices. His analysis was perceptive and somewhat uncomfortable. Technova's interest in DataBridge was probably motivated more by public relations value than by genuine commitment to social impact. Partnering with them could provide resources for expansion, but it could also transform us from independent advocates into corporate marketing assets. The decision became clearer during a conversation with my father that evening. Richard had called to check on DataBridge's launch and to share news about additional Austin business leaders who'd expressed interest in supporting our work. His enthusiasm for the nonprofit was genuine and infectious, evidence of someone who'd discovered unexpected satisfaction in supporting mission-driven initiatives. "I had lunch with Victoria Sterling yesterday," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd facilitated a valuable connection. "She's interested in becoming a major sponsor, and her approach would be completely different from what you'd get from Techno." Victoria's interest wasn't surprising. Her company had been exploring data analytics solutions for logistics optimization, and her personal commitment to community development was well established in Austin's philanthropic circles. Unlike Technova, which would view DataBridge as a marketing opportunity, Victoria would see the nonprofit as an extension of her own social impact initiatives. "What kind of sponsorship is she considering?" I asked. "Long-term funding without operational control. She understands that DataBridge's value comes from its independence, and she wants to preserve that while providing resources for sustainable growth." The contrast with Technova's approach was instructive. Victoria Sterling's business success had come through patient investment in valuable capabilities, rather than aggressive acquisition of competitive assets. Her sponsorship would strengthen DataBridge without compromising its mission or independence. "I think we should meet with her," I said, already anticipating Alex's approval of the decision. The meeting with Victoria took place the following week at her company's headquarters in a converted warehouse that balanced industrial aesthetics with environmental sustainability. Her office featured reclaimed wood furniture and windows that maximized natural light, reflecting someone who valued authenticity over corporate ostentation. I've been following DataBridge's development since Alex first pitched the concept, Victoria said as we settled into chairs arranged around a conference table made from recycled materials. The mission aligns perfectly with Sterling Dynamics' commitment to community investment. The conversation that followed was unlike any funding discussion I'd experienced during DataPulse's development. Instead of focusing on growth metrics and market penetration strategies, Victoria asked detailed questions about impact measurement and long-term sustainability. She understood that DataBridge's success would be measured by the effectiveness of the nonprofit organizations we served rather than by our own revenue generation. I'd like to propose a 3-year funding commitment, Victoria said after we'd discussed DataBridge's operational needs and expansion plans. $500,000 annually with the option to renew based on demonstrated impact rather than financial performance. The offer was generous and strategically sound, providing enough resources to expand DataBridge's capabilities while maintaining the independence necessary for authentic mission-driven work. Unlike venture capital funding, which would require eventual returns to investors, Victoria's sponsorship was structured as genuine philanthropy that aligned with our nonprofit status. There's one condition, Victoria continued. I'd like DataBridge to document its impact rigorously and share that documentation with other potential sponsors. The goal is to demonstrate that technology-enabled social impact initiatives can be scaled effectively across different communities and cause error. Her condition actually strengthened DataBridge's mission rather than constraining it. Rigorous impact measurement would improve our ability to serve nonprofit partners effectively while building evidence that could attract additional sponsors and accelerate the movement toward democratized analytical tools. Alex and I accepted Victoria's sponsorship proposal that same afternoon, setting in motion an expansion plan that would enable DataBridge to serve nonprofit organizations across Texas and eventually throughout the Southwest. The funding would support hiring additional developers and analysts while establishing regional partnerships with community foundations and social service networks. The announcement of Victoria's sponsorship coincided with DataBridge's first measurable impact results from our pilot partner. Maria Santos reported that the Central Texas Food Bank had improved their distribution efficiency by 37%, enabling them to serve an additional 1,200 families per month with the same resource allocation. Rivera's Homeless Services Organization had identified intervention patterns that increased permanent housing success rates by 22%. These outcomes weren't just statistical improvements. They represented real people whose lives had been tangibly improved through better resource allocation and more effective service delivery. DataBridge was proving that sophisticated analytical tools could enhance social impact when deployed by organizations with clear missions and community accountability. The success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Nicole Parker called to request a follow-up interview about DataBridge's expanding impact, while representatives from the Austin Community Foundation and United Way began exploring partnership opportunities. Most surprisingly, I received a call from Catherine Walsh, the lawyer who'd been engaged to my brother before discovering his deceptions about my reputation and capability. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly," Catherine said, her voice carrying the measured professionalism that had impressed me during her housing rights advocacy. "I've been following DataBridge's development, and I think there might be opportunities for collaboration with my housing advocacy work." The conversation revealed that Catherine had been using DataPulse's analytics capabilities to strengthen her legal arguments in housing rights cases, demonstrating patterns of discrimination and resource allocation that would have been difficult to prove without sophisticated data analysis. DataBridge could extend those capabilities to housing advocacy organizations that couldn't afford enterprise software licenses. "I'd like to introduce DataBridge to the Texas Fair Housing Coalition," Catherine continued. "We have member organizations across the state that need exactly the kind of analytical support you're providing to other nonprofits." Her proposal represented an opportunity to expand DataBridge's impact into civil rights advocacy, while building partnerships with organizations that shared our commitment to democratizing access to powerful analytical tools. The housing rights sector had particular need for data analysis capabilities that could demonstrate systemic discrimination patterns and measure the effectiveness of intervention strategy. The partnership with Catherine's Housing Advocacy Network materialized quickly, adding 12 additional nonprofit organizations to DataBridge's client base within 6 weeks. Each new partnership strengthened our understanding of how analytical tools could enhance social impact while revealing additional opportunities for expansion into related cause areas. By December, DataBridge was serving 43 nonprofit organizations across Texas, with documented impact improvements averaging 28% across different program areas. The outcomes validated our original hypothesis that sophisticated analytical capabilities could significantly enhance the effectiveness of mission-driven organizations when those tools were designed specifically for nonprofit needs, rather than adapted from corporate applications. The success also created new challenges around scaling and sustainability. Demand for DataBridge's services was growing faster than our ability to onboard new clients, while the complexity of nonprofit data requirements was testing the limits of our current platform capability. We needed to expand our development team and enhance our technology infrastructure to meet increasing demand without compromising service quality. These growth challenges were exactly the kind of problems I'd hoped to encounter when leaving Technova's corporate structure to pursue mission-driven work. Unlike the scaling pressures I'd experienced with DataPulse, which had been driven by investor expectations and competitive dynamics, DataBridge's growth was motivated by genuine demand from organizations working to improve their community. The annual Austin Business Excellence Awards ceremony in December provided an unexpected opportunity to reflect on the distance I'd traveled since my father had dismissed my entrepreneurial ambitions at the same event 3 years earlier. This time I attended as a guest rather than a presenter, watching Richard accept recognition for his leadership in promoting social impact initiatives among Austin's business community. His acceptance speech surprised me with its references to DataBridge and the importance of supporting entrepreneurs who prioritize mission over profit maximization. The man who'd once called my company a complete failure was now publicly advocating for exactly the kind of work that DataBridge represents. "Innovation without purpose is just clever engineering," he said from the podium, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned valuable lessons about the relationship between success and significance. Austin's entrepreneurial community has an opportunity to demonstrate that technological advancement can serve social progress rather than simply generating returns for investors. When he returned to our table after the ceremony, Richard's expression carried the satisfaction of someone who'd discovered unexpected alignment between personal values and public recognition. "I'm proud of what you've built with DataBridge," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion rather than the calculated approval that had characterized our previous interaction. "You've demonstrated something I didn't understand when you started DataPulse, that the most valuable innovations often serve the people who need them most rather than the people who can afford them most." His words represented a fundamental shift in perspective that extended beyond our personal relationship to encompass his understanding of entrepreneurship and social responsibility. Richard Hartwell had built his fortune through traditional business metrics, but DataBridge had shown him alternative measures of success that prioritized impact over income. The recognition felt validating, but it also highlighted how much my own definition of success had evolved since receiving the Forbes coverage that had vindicated DataPulse's commercial viability. Financial achievement had been satisfying, but it had also been incomplete. DataBridge was providing the sense of purpose that wealth alone couldn't deliver. As 2025 drew to a close, Alex and I spent New Year's Eve working on strategic plans for DataBridge's expansion into additional states, while maintaining the personalized service approach that had made our Texas partnership successful. The nonprofit had exceeded every impact target we'd established while building sustainable funding relationships that supported continued growth. The evening felt reflective rather than celebratory, tinged with satisfaction about what we'd accomplished while acknowledging the work that remained ahead. DataBridge had proven that sophisticated analytical tools could enhance social impact when deployed thoughtfully and sustainably. The challenge now was scaling that model to serve the thousands of nonprofit organizations across the country that needed similar support. Do you ever miss the simplicity of just trying to build a profitable company? Alex asked as we reviewed partnership proposals from community foundations in Colorado and New Mexico. Sometimes I admitted, but I don't miss the feeling that success was measured by metrics that didn't align with my values. DataBridge lets us pursue excellence and impact simultaneously. His question prompted reflection on the journey that had brought me from corporate security through startup uncertainty to mission-driven entrepreneur. Each transition had required abandoning familiar definitions of success in favor of more complex, but ultimately more satisfying measures of achievement. The $8 million from DataPulse's acquisition had provided financial security, but DataBridge had provided something more valuable: proof that I could build something meaningful that aligned with my deepest convictions about technology's potential for social good. The nonprofit had demonstrated that success without purpose was hollow, while purpose without sustainability was ineffective. As midnight approached and Austin's skyline glittered with the lights of a city that had embraced technological innovation as a path toward economic growth, I felt grateful for the journey that had taught me to measure achievement through impact rather than income. Sometimes the greatest success isn't proving others wrong about your capabilities, it's proving yourself capable of something more meaningful than what others thought possible. The new year would bring fresh challenges and opportunities to expand DataBridge's impact while maintaining the values that had made our work authentic and effective. But tonight, surrounded by evidence of what mission-driven entrepreneurship could accomplish, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing your work matters to people whose work matters to their community. DataBridge had become more than a nonprofit organization. It was proof that technological sophistication and social responsibility could be integrated effectively when entrepreneurs chose purpose over profit as their primary measure of success. Sometimes the most valuable exit strategy isn't selling what you've built, but building something so meaningful that you never want to exit at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.